It's Wednesday, May 28th, 2014, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are Missouri School of Journalism colleagues Mike McKean and Jim Flink. On our program this week, the role college journalists and social media are both playing in the reporting of this weekend's mass shooting near the University of California, Santa Barbara. A Nebraska watchdog site decides to sit out covering the gubernatorial race because of donations it's received from one of the candidates. And the BBC issues a directive to its journalists: don't do anything stupid. We'll talk about what prompted it. And there's a whole lot, hopefully, that we'll also get to as well. But let's start with tonight's hour-long special on NBC. Brian Williams' sit-down interview with Edward Snowden.
What are you doing in Russia? Have you met Putin? Have you spoken with Putin? Are there minders that you're aware of? On the range between ticker tape parade and life sentence, what do you think ought to happen to you if and when you return to the United States?
That dramatic promo has been running on NBC almost nonstop since the network announced its big get last Thursday. This isn't the first time that Snowden has sat down with a reporter. Why the big deal around this?
It is the first time an American network television news operation has had an interview with him. And I think that probably is significant, as you're going to see with another story we're going to talk about a little bit later. Even when some prestige media, if they're regional or international, get onto a story, they don't have the same kind of reach. And if Brian Williams if we get good answers from Snowden to those provocative questions, it probably is a good journalistic piece as well as a ratings grab.
And outside of the drama, and it is a real-life drama straight out of a John le Carre kind of a novel, there's also been some evidence that Washington is making moves to amend the problems that were raised by the initial release of all these documents, including the fact that the president has criticized the NSA's procedures and policies, and this week the House passed something to basically outlaw those kinds of practices within the NSA.
So we don't know yet if we're going to get straight answers to some of those questions that were pointedly asked in that promo. There have been some small tidbits that have leaked out yet. Do you anticipate that we're going to hear anything new that we haven't already heard either in the Guardian's reporting or other papers or at the South by Southwest interview?
Well, I think there's a difference between whether there'll be something new and there'll be something that we might call really newsworthy. I mean, for example, the story that they released yesterday on Nightly News, which is basically Snowden saying they may be downplaying at the NSA or in the federal government what I did, what my role was. I was really basically trained as a spy. Okay, that's new information. Is it really big and newsworthy? Probably not. If it were truly newsworthy, then NBC would have used that and would have released it instead of waiting 4 or 5 days before it came out.
I think the thing that's interesting about this whole sort of production is the relationship between Glenn Greenwald, who I'm sure we'll get into a little bit,
yes,
who really worked with Snowden on releasing this information and really made it sort of available to the mainstream public. The relationship between Greenwald, Snowden, and NBC, which is more than just we got an interview. This is a collaboration.
Let's talk about that a little bit more, and Greenwald's working with First Look Media and the partnership that's going on there between that company and NBC.
So NBC has described it as a collaboration. They say that money hasn't changed hands, that basically they're just exchanging stories when the stories make sense. But First Look Media is the company that was started by Pierre Omidyar, the guy who founded eBay, putting a lot of money into trying to do online-only news. And the biggest, sort of most prominent foray so far has been with Glenn Greenwald and the publication that they're putting out to focus on the NSA and other sort of data security issues. So it makes sense that they'd be tied together. And boy, if you watch any time that there's any reference lately on NBC News to Glenn Greenwald, it's all about, oh, and by the way, he's got this new book out. So there's clearly a lot of back scratching going on there.
And what's interesting about this is there's kind of two ways to look at this. One is it takes that kind of force, journalists working together, different organizations working together, when you are facing this kind of an issue of this this kind of international importance. So on the one hand, you can say, well, yeah, it stands to reason that a guy that basically has been exiled to live in Russia because he will be arrested the minute he gets out of that situation, that he might want to collaborate with those kinds of folks. On the other hand, this is not an interview of any traditional sense. This is a collaboration. This is news organizations that have worked together to put together a fairly promotional event that is also a news event.
It seems pretty obvious, too, that Snowden, at least in part, is giving this interview to an American television network because there are negotiations behind the scenes to see if there is some way that he can get out of Russia and come home to the United States and not spend the rest of his life in prison.
And I think the more that other journalists tap into this and tap into all of these records, the more we are learning what Snowden perceived to be the problem in the very first place that might open that door.
So let me ask you this. Is going on, is this made-for-television moment that's going to happen this evening? Is there an audience for it? We've talked about different times in the past when we hear about data breaches and we hear about credit card information or identity information that is either compromised or misused as it relates to how stores do things, is information given up through apps. We're living our lives not all that differently than we were before Edward Snowden came forward with all of this. We often talk here in the School of Journalism about serving our public audience. Mabel from Moberly. Will she care about this? Is this something she's going to tune into tonight?
I don't know. I mean, I think some people underestimated initially the legs that this story was going to have, because this isn't about, Edward Snowden releasing documents showing the U.S. government is spying on folks in other countries. I mean, although that's part of it, but that they have access to being able to spy on people in this country. And so maybe Mabel from Moberly might be interested in it, but that's also why they're promoting it as with all, basic, very simplified graphics, traitor, patriot, right? Trying to attract the audience that's not been following all the details of the case.
Yeah, and I think that the American public should, whether they will or not. It's hard to know what the American public sort of latches onto. But I think this is a story that the American public should stay in touch with and continue to watch.
Okay, well, what prompts a whistleblower to come forward to tell their story and attempt to right a wrong? How much time do you let pass trying to work out a problem through channels? CNN's Brian Stelter asked Dr. Sam Foote that very question Sunday morning on Reliable Sources. Foote, a recent retiree from the VA Medical Center in Phoenix, dropped the dime on the countless delays and incompetence at the hospital.
Well, I started to think about that when it was such a long delay in November and December. And I basically told San Diego that if they weren't here before the first of the year, on the second, I would be in the Arizona Republic's office. And so they did come over, and they put a team together and did come over. And I told them I'd wait another month, and if nothing happened, I would think about doing that again. And what I did was I wrote another letter, and then when there was no response to that, I went to the Republic.
From the Republic, Foote went to CNN, and from there the story blossomed into a major national issue heading into the Memorial Day weekend.
What have you learned about how the media does or doesn't work?
Well, you just have to be persistent, and they work pretty well once you get to it. And it was interesting because people started picking up the Arizona Republic article, and I started getting calls from the Wall Street Journal and from the New York Times. If you told me a month ago my picture would have been on the second page in color of the Wall Street Journal, I would have said you're crazy, but that's what happened.
So let's go back to that theme from a minute ago, the idea of patriot or traitor. It's a question that hasn't even come up in relationship to Sam Foote as it did with Edward Snowden. Are all whistleblowers not created equal?
I mean, obviously not. And in this instance, I mean, who is going to say that it's wrong to blow the whistle on a government agency that perhaps is letting veterans die, and it's even covering up the fact that it's doing so? I mean, there really isn't another side to that story per se. So.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question that whistleblowers are handled differently depending on the information that it is that they're revealing is going on and the organization that they're covering. And clearly, Mike's right. When it comes to healthcare, it's something that we can all see ourselves in that situation, and particularly when it involves veterans.
I have to say, though, I mean, again, this points out this notion of, will anybody watch? Why does it matter that NBC got to get with Snowden? It matters that CNN followed this story, because as great a newspaper as the Arizona Republic is, and the investigations it's done over the years, they've been covering this story for a long time. And as we know, There have been problems within the VA and their waiting lists for a long time. CNN, Drew Griffin and their investigative team have been covering this story for a little while, but until they latched onto the hook, and the hook was that veterans are dying while being on these fake waiting lists, that's when it finally gets the nation's attention and the government has to do something about it.
I hate to sound like a cynic, but how much of this and how this story took off may or may not have to do with its proximity to the Memorial Day weekend?
Well, I think that it's smart to place it on the Memorial Day weekend. That's when people, it's a little bit raw. People's awareness is a little bit greater. People have dropped all of their other distractions, and so they're paying attention. So it's smart programming. It's smart to cover that story then.
I mean, if you believe Drew Griffin, though, the reporter on this story, he basically said that, we had the good fortune of sort of people looking the other way while the Malaysia Airlines thing was playing out and some of these other stories. But when we had it, we went it right away as soon as there was a news hole, as soon as there was something, an opening to shove this story into, and a holiday weekend is a good time to do that.
Okay. You brought up the Malaysia flight and how we've talked in the past about how CNN covered that story probably a month and a half or 2 months longer than maybe it needed to give the level of attention it was giving. Does a story like this kind of take some of those jokes away from CNN, bring back maybe some of that credibility that was lost during some of those other...
No, but on the other hand, I mean, it just proves that CNN, like any other news organization, can walk and chew gum at the same time. I mean, they can do silly things and they can do great things, and that's just what you pay the price. You get the money to do the great investigations by doing some of the other silly stuff that draws eyeballs and advertisers.
The other thing is that from a resource standpoint, covering the Malaysia story is frankly easier. It's less resource intensive. It is the kind of thing that you can bring experts on, but you don't have to allocate internal resources, reporters, producers, people to go out and find, like this story with the VA or even with the Edward Snowden, where you have to vet articles, you have to vet sources, you have to really invest resources. Indeed.
Very time intensive to be able to do all of that. The calm of the holiday weekend was rocked by word of another mass shooting, this time just off the campus of the University of California, Santa Barbara in Isla Vista. Elliot Rodger killed 6 and injured another 13 people during Friday night's rampage. Evidence Rodger left behind, including a 130-plus page manifesto and this YouTube video, are leading investigators to believe the plot may have been years in the making.
Well, this is my last video. It all has to come to this. Tomorrow is the day of retribution. The day in which I will have my revenge against humanity, against all of you. For the last 8 years of my life, ever since I've hit puberty, I've been forced to endure an existence of loneliness, rejection, and unfulfilled desires.
That video goes on for nearly 7 minutes, and watching it to its end is chilling, to say the very least. What surprised me, though, more than anything else, was how quickly news organizations rushed to put that YouTube video in its entirety on the air and on their websites. Let's talk for a minute about the ethics of doing this.
Well, it's one of those things where I can see it both ways. I would probably err if I were a news director on showing it. And it's simple. And, look, I fully understand that somehow by airing that video, a monster, if you want to call it, somebody who commits a crime like this is getting what they want. I fully understand that argument. The thing about it is that more information about who these people are, about what motivates them, might lead to some sort of preventative measure. It might not as well, but for me, from an ethical standpoint, I'm going to say we want to know more about who did this and why, if for no other reason than to prevent it in the future.
I have to agree with that, and I mean, I think always more information is better than less. They put warnings up. They had a slate at the beginning of that video that said some people may be disturbed by it, and they gave the warnings on the air before they showed it. But I do believe, as Jim does, that we need to know that, if for no other reason, to understand the motivation of this young man and the turmoil that he was going through.
So how would it be different if it was a written suicide note?
Well, I think this is someone who was homicidal, not just suicidal.
Okay.
Perhaps suicidal, but for me, that's where the line is.
Well, who did he leave this? If he left a suicide note, there might be a question of who he left the note for. He posted this video on YouTube. He wanted the public to see it. Now, that doesn't mean we have to give him what he wants, but the audience for that video is different than a suicide note might have been. It might have been for his family or loved ones. We don't know.
Okay, well, for all of the coverage this story is getting in the mainstream media, the outlets that you and I consume every day, there's a bit of controversy brewing on the UCSB campus. There are two student-run newspapers there, and they are each taking very different approaches to this incident. Reporters and editors of The Nexus, the independent student newspaper, have been publishing continuously since 10:57 Friday night, which was about an hour after the first report of shots fired. Its competitor, the student government-financed paper called The Bottom Line, has posted just one single item. 2 days after the shooting, it was an op-ed entitled, "Why We Have Not Yet Published Anything on the Isla Vista Shooting." That op-ed said that the reason that it's chosen not to publish anything else is that it's trying to adhere to the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, which says not to engage in any journalism that might do harm. Is ignoring the story a way to really honor that code? Is that the spirit of the intention?
The code talks about minimizing harm, and it means minimizing harm to the public or people that are a part of a news story. When they wrote this editorial, they said they wanted to minimize the emotional harm to their own journalists. That is not what the Code of Ethics is about. And in fact, I think they did a disservice to their audience, the students of this campus, the victims of this, and the friends of the victims, by not covering it at all.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question that this is the time for a news organization to shine as much light on as many different facets of this story, to inform and to educate people on the issues that are surrounding a major news event like this. Very clearly, I would side with the organization that covered this wall to wall from its inception, because that's what journalism is, not code notwithstanding.
I mean, there was an editor quoted in one of the pieces you got on our links blog, I think from the San Francisco Chronicle, which basically was sort of praising this paper for not engaging in so-called tragedy porn that she says the media tend to wallow in it. And okay, I get that. But I also think that it's worse for us to be so sensitive about, how fragile we are that we're unwilling to talk about the truth of terrible incidents like this.
Well, if one of the purposes of student media on college campuses is to help train the next generation of journalists, what do you say to that student journalist who says, I'm not going to cover that story because of the harm it might cause me? Professionally speaking, that might mean we wouldn't get news coverage of 9/11. We wouldn't get news coverage of lots of other stories that we are the first recorders of history. This publication is choosing to not participate in that recording of history.
Well, and what news is what is unusual, and oftentimes it is awful. And are we always well trained to handle those situations? I don't think journalists necessarily are always trained to console victims of crime in real time and those kinds of things. Nonetheless, as you said, not only are we there to record history, but we're also there to shine light on problems.
Can I just say one other thing about this story before we leave it? So, the media, and it's our job to try to do this, and the public tries to find the deeper meaning in tragedies like this, because if we can't make some sense of it, it really is horrible. And so we have all the conversations about whether, it's gun culture or it's mental illness or whether it's, the culture of sexual violence and all on campuses. But, I thought one media organization really, and I'm not saying that I support any particular solution, but I found this to be a really arresting headline in all places, The Onion. What they said on this story was, quote, "No way to prevent this, says only nation where this regularly happens." So I think we have a little bit of soul searching to do on whatever you think is the cause of this story.
Okay. Remember last week we told you about a ban the Missouri Department of Corrections placed on the May issue of St. Louis Magazine. The issue contains an article called How We Kill, a feature on how the state carries out the death penalty, and corrections officials worried it could provoke a violent or hateful reaction among prisoners. The Department of Corrections has reversed its decision after an appeal on the part of the publishers of that magazine, and the ban has been lifted. Prisoners now have access to the publication again. You'd expect a site called Nebraska Watchdog to be keeping an eye on things, right? Covering the political campaigns and looking out for the voter. What happens when the poll that you're supposed to be covering donated the money to fund and start up your site? Apparently, you sit out the campaign. Omaha businessman Pete Ricketts is one of the site's financial backers. He's also the Republican candidate for Nebraska governor. The goal here is to avoid an apparent conflict of interest, but in a way, aren't they missing out on the opportunity to do the watchdog journalism that they were created to do?
You could say that. You know, one of the things that I always try to caution people when they say the news is reporting this or the mainstream media is to try to define who is the news? Who owns the publication that you're reading? What do you know about the publication? I just had this conversation with a family member this past weekend about a new media startup that they had never heard of before. Find out who it is that you're watching and who's supporting it. The fact that this was a political candidate that was supporting this watchdog organization, when I hear the word watchdog, I think independent, not perhaps being funded by someone who's involved in partisan politics at all.
I will say, though, I do applaud them for acknowledging an obvious conflict of interest and saying they're staying away from it. I think people should know, and we talked about this some years ago on this program, but this isn't the only group like this. In fact, the man that's running for governor is a member of what's called the Franklin Center for Government and Public Integrity. It's a conservative, libertarian organization, and they fund a dozen of these. There's the Missouri Watchdog, for example. And I'm all in favor of having anybody who will cover state government, because it gets covered so poorly by so few news organizations today. And as long as they're wearing their heart on their sleeve, we know who their funders are, and we can look at their stories and see if there's any bias. I'm okay with that.
Sure, it goes back to the issue of more information is better than less. It doesn't bother me at all that we have lots of different points of views. That's what we want to have. I just want to make sure that people understand from whence that information comes, that if it is in fact being labeled as unbiased or a watchdog organization, that is in fact what it represents, or that at least you know what it represents.
It's been a while since we talked about what's going on in East Ukraine. The situation there isn't improving, and in fact, for journalists, it's getting worse by the day. Jim, is the host of our Global Journalist program. Bring us up to speed on what's been going on there.
Well, I sent you an article yesterday about the fact that since the unrest in the Ukraine has really been fomenting, and pro-Russian forces, if you want to say, have been taking different towns, that journalists have been disappearing. And in fact, this article claimed that a journalist is disappearing just about every day covering this event. Certainly, we are well aware of the very strong-arm tactics that are taking place, particularly in the eastern part of the country. But I thought it was important for us to point out that as journalists that are going into some of these regions where there's lawlessness, that journalism and journalists, that's one of the toughest jobs to perform in these types of situations.
And it's always been tough for journalists in a conflict zone, but I think that we've seen a ratcheting up or even just a more blunt effort to take out, I don't mean literally take out, but to remove, sometimes literally take out the journalists who can shed light on what's really going on in a place like this.
And we've seen it in Syria, and we've seen it in other places. We just saw it in Libya, where very high-profile journalists are being targeted because they have the megaphone.
Saw it in Venezuela as well not too long ago. Don't do anything stupid. Sounds like the words of a parent to a teenager before a night out on the town, not the warning to a staff of BBC News, but it was. The staff was told point blank not to do anything stupid after an editor violated the Beeb's social media policy. Jasmine Lawrence tweeted, "Why I'm voting UKIP to stand up for white, middle-class, middle-aged men with sexist, racist views, totally underrepresented in politics today." Of course, meant to be somewhat sarcastic there. That account has since been disabled. So when we talk about conflict of interest here, Lawrence was actually working on election coverage for the BBC.
And UKIP is the United Kingdom Independent Party, which, by the way, won a lot of seats in the European Parliament, as did many other, some people will call them far-right or right-wing or whatever parties. And so for her to be covering this and then basically accusing them, as she did in her tweet, she deserved to be pulled from that coverage at the very least. And there are some people who say she should be fired from the BBC. I don't know about that, but she certainly should be punished and held up as an example of what you don't do.
We have been talking around the journalism school for a very long time about best practices with journalists and social media, and clearly this would be a case study to show what not to do. But I think it shines the light on the fact that too many journalists are using social media as an extension of themselves, and they don't recognize the difference between a social media that represents them personally and sometimes how that might be linked to what they do professionally. I just think there needs to be greater awareness by all journalists who are using social media about how to use it well and what to avoid.
So here's a question I would have for you. Looking at that, we've seen journalists here in the United States who've made missteps like that using social media, and in a lot of those cases they would be fired. Having just been pulled off of the election coverage, is that a cultural difference? Are there different standards maybe among the European press in England as there might be here? I don't think she would have just been pulled off of the election had that happened here.
Well, and the BBC has been under a barrage from folks in Great Britain and elsewhere for some while, as one, being leaning to the left, two, being publicly financed at a time when there are private media who could conceivably be filling the gap for the BBC, but it is still a world-class news organization. And they have tried, by putting out policies like this, to keep their journalists from stating their political opinions on the air. This is a really age-old argument, though. Let's just say that you don't do anything stupid. You don't wear your political leanings on your sleeve. You have political leanings.
We all
and
do.
they're going to affect the kinds of stories you choose to cover or not cover and how you cover those stories.
I don't think there's any question. You know, you can say you're unbiased. You have biases. You need to know what those biases are, and you need to guard against those when you are trying to be an independent journalist. That said, are there cultural differences? There are, and depending on where you go in the far reaches of the earth, you're going to find different rules apply to different folks. Nonetheless, this one, if you're covering politics or if you're on the political desk, stay away from political issues on social media.
Okay, quickly, before time's up today, I want to talk about a change that you might or might not even notice when you're watching CNN. Two more of its daily news anchors will be moving from the network's Atlanta headquarters to New York. Once Carol Costello and Brooke Baldwin make the move in August, all of CNN's weekday programming will be presented from New York, while several of those shows are still produced in Atlanta. Jeff Zucker says that this is being done because it'll be easier to book guests in New York studios, and it's also harder to attract top talent when they find out that they may have to move to Atlanta. Thoughts on this?
I think it's probably not unpredictable. You know, the fact that they've had to have a New York presence, just like if you're covering national news, you have to have a Washington presence. You have to have those things. It probably makes a lot of sense.
And if more of your coverage is going to be not the spot news daily stuff, but these longer form pieces and Anthony Bourdain and whatever, you do want to get to talent and talent agencies. And so it's probably better to be in New York.
All of which are centered in New York.
But if the producers are working in Atlanta, is that going to be hard to do? Work with your producer states away?
Not in this day and age, I don't think it is. I mean, certainly if it's ever been easier than now, I don't know when it would have been.
Okay, well, that music means we're pretty much out of time for this week. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about the topics we talked about today on our links blog. Find that under the Programs tab at KBIA.org. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again, leave us comments and questions, and get a preview of what we'll be talking about next week. Our thanks to associate producer Hope Kerwan and to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show, and to Pat Akers for handling the audio. I'm Amy Simons. Be sure to join us again next week when we're back with another edition of Views of the News.